world is changing fast. New technologies are impacting how we think about products, services, and the way we live our lives. Nowhere is this trend more present than in financial services, where new business models and customer expectations are changing our conceptions about banking, finance, and the very nature of money. Welcome to Rebank, a visionary podcast about banking, fintech, and the future. The future of banking is here.
Hello and welcome to Rebank. I'm your host, Will Beeson. Today we're joined by Christo Carmen. Christo is the CEO and co-founder of TransferWise, a payments company fighting to break banks' usurious grip on FX and international transfers. TransferWise is one of Europe's greatest fintech success stories, most recently valued at $3.5 billion in a secondary offering earlier this year. The company has nearly 2,000 employees around the world, moves $5.5 billion a month between nearly 100 countries, and saves customers over $1 billion a year in fees. In this conversation, Christo and I discuss the state of the FX and international payments market, how TransferWise helps banks as much as it challenges them, and his views on the evolution of competition in digital banking. For our entire back catalog and to sign up to our newsletter, please visit bankingthefuture.com. Thank you very much for joining us today. Please welcome Christo Carmen. Christo Carmen, welcome to Rebank.
Pleasure to be here.
So it's great to connect with you. I've been following your progress for years and am, like many of our listeners, I'm sure, an active user of your product, which I think is phenomenal. So maybe quick, very high-level intro to TransferWise and what you guys do.
Absolutely. The story of TransferWise really started now more than 10 years ago when I moved to London from my native Estonia. I moved for work, so I had a pretty good salary. I was consulting banks. And then over the Christmas time, I was moving my extra bonus back to my savings account, which was in Estonia. And the way it worked back then, that was in 2008, you would go to your HSBC branch, you'd fill in a form, and the money would show up in euros maybe a week later. Now, the challenge was about 500 euros was missing from what I expected. So I started looking for it, and I asked my bank in Estonia what happened, I asked HSBC what happened, and they said it was all by the book. So then I realized the way it works is that naively I was looking at the exchange rate that Google told me is the exchange rate between pounds and euros at the time, but bank was taking that exchange rate and marking it up by 5%. Hence, no surprise, they did tell me it cost me 15 euros to make the transfer, but it ended up being 515 euros in the hidden exchange rate. So that was that. I had a friend at the time who had the exact opposite story. He was still paid in euros, but lived in London, so he needed to move euros to London. And what we started doing then was just swapping money. I made just a pound-to-pound transfer to his Lloyd's account in the UK. Then we looked at the real exchange rate on Google, and he put the equivalent amount of euros onto my account in Estonia. So I got rid of my pounds into his account in London, and he moved euros into my account in Estonia. So both of us saved about 500 euros equivalent on both sides of the transfer. So that was the kind of the very origin that solved the problem for us. And in 2011, that's now more than 8 years ago, we launched with a pretty much exactly that as a method of moving money from pounds to euros and euros to pounds. We collected pounds in the UK and we collected euros in Eurozone, and then we paid out to the recipients. It was literally reported as in the opening blog post by TechCrunch as there's this website built by two Estonian dudes that lets you move money. And what do you know, 15 minutes later, some money started arriving on our accounts. So it was an incredible success story given it was 2011.
Wow.
And the word fintech didn't yet exist.
Okay, so I have to start, I think, with the most basic question, and one that you must get all the time, but I'm interested in your answer to it. Why haven't incumbent banks changed their model in response to TransferWise?
The short answer is they don't have to. Retail banks have a large product suite, and if you rank them by priority, international payments is not going to be for most banks, for the vast majority of the 26,000 banks around the world. It's not going to be the top revenue earner. It's not going to be the reason why people choose their bank over a different bank. So this is not such an important thing for them. That's one. So the short answer is because they can. The second part of the answer is it's also a little tricky because they've never told their customers how much it costs. So they told me it costs 15 euros. Yes, they can go and say, yep, it's now 5 euros. So there's a little reduction in fee. But because they never told me they charged me 500 euros as part of the exchange rate, it's very hard for them to kind of make the press announcement that now it's 400 euros or 300 euros or 200 euros. So that makes it slightly trickier. And then there's another element to this that took us a while to realize, that being, we initially thought that banks are just taking this all as a profit. It's a lot of money, and we couldn't really imagine what would cost that much to, like, that service doesn't cost that much to provide. And then we started seeing banks who actually recommended TransferWise to their users. The first one in Hungary, when we launched there a few years ago, we saw a spike of users, and it turned out it was because their bank recommended Hungarians to use TransferWise. It was a small niche bank, and for them, it was so expensive to do those international transfers for themselves, and it was a bad user experience at the back of it. So you charge a lot, it costs you a lot, so you're kind of net zero, and you have a bad user experience. So I think the bank managers themselves were using TransferWise. And then they just taught the bank staff in the branches that if someone needs to make an international transfer, show them how to download the TransferWise app, how to set up a transfer to the US or to Thailand or wherever they need the money to go, and how to fund it from this bank's account. And problem solved. They still had kind of net zero in terms of profits, but they at least had a happy customer.
Mm-hmm. And I think the integration piece, the kind of B2B side of TransferWise, is an increasingly important part of the business. And many of the customers of that are banks, right? In fact, I think in the US, you recently launched with at least one, maybe regional bank. It sounds like the US, maybe there's more scope for partnerships going forward. But can you just talk a bit about that B2B proposition and the uptake you've seen by banks?
This was actually inspired by this Hungarian bank that I just talked through, and recognizing that it's certainly not great that banks are untransparent or intransparent, and we shouldn't tolerate this. But even if they were transparent, it would still be a very expensive service line for them to offer. And since 2016, we've started opening up our APIs initially for selected partners. N26, a German challenger bank, was the first one to go live on TransferWise. So they immediately got international reach. So N26 account holders could use TransferWise from within their app. And since then, we've rolled it out to other large challenger banks like Monzo in the UK. Recently, a bank called Up in Australia announced they're integrating Bank in Netherlands, and a few more. And interestingly, also traditional banks are interested in the same, because for many of them also, it's not their core business, but they want their customers to have a great experience. So a large banking group, BPC of France, announced last summer they're working on an integration. And the one that you referred to that just went live in the US is Stanford Credit Union. They're a smaller bank and focused on the Stanford students and staff, who are, of course, quite international. What else is cool about the Stanford Credit Union launch is that because moving payments, even domestically in the US, is quite expensive, it now turns out that Stanford Credit Union is the cheapest bank in the US to make international payments. Kind of shows up in our comparison boards. It's even cheaper than using TransferWise.
I feel like there's a play there to just make domestic payments in the US using TransferWise. I mean, the system is so bad. You can't make an account-to-account transfer.
I mean, you have Venmo now, and clearly there was an opening in the market, and when there's a thing that people need to do or want to do, and there's no facilitator for this, then things like Venmo will come about. And similarly, we saw that in China, where the banks weren't really that easy to use. So suddenly you have Ant Financial, Alipay, and WeChat Pay just kind of sweeping up the domestic market because it's a much more convenient solution.
Yeah. Well, Venmo still, you have to offload the funds once you receive them, whereas TransferWise is account to account.
It's true, but even us, we're relying on the infrastructure. So absolutely, moving money from one TransferWise account to another is fast, but that's not rocket science. That's not so interesting. When we move out to the other bank accounts in the US, we still have to go through the
ACH network.
ACH network that is now much slower than nearly every other developed country in the world.
Well, it seems like there may be very, very slow progress on that front, but
it will come.
Time will tell.
It will come.
To this point of kind of B2C via things like not only the account-to-account payments that you guys do internationally, but also the borderless account, which you guys operate, which is a fantastic product, and the B2B, i.e. partnerships piece. If you think about TransferWise and project forward a few years, what's the driver of your growth, of your value creation? Are you guys a B2B company or a B2C company?
We go back to basics on those questions quite often, and the basic problem that we're solving is moving money cross-border. Whether that's businesses doing that, individuals doing that, institutions even, or large corporates doing that. At the end of the day, it's still the end consumer is paying for all of this. If the cost occurs immediately to them or somewhere further down the line, it's still our kind of collective cost. The large consultancies like McKinsey and Bain have studied this kind of industry or problem, and they calculate that people, so either individuals directly or through small businesses, so retail users, spend about $200 billion every year on cross-border money flows. So that is either in those transaction fees that are 15 euros or more likely to be hidden in these exchange rates. So this whole thing is $200 billion that we all collectively pay for. We count, we try to be pretty precise at this, counting on how much do we save our users who use TransferWise. Because we know where the money comes from, we know what the bank would charge them, both in hidden fees and transaction fees. And so we calculate it's now running around £1 billion a year, so about $1.3 billion a year. So we kind of solved $1.2 billion out of $200 billion. So this is the impact that we've had on the $200 billion number. So we're still like 0.5% of the overall retail flows. Therefore, if we take the step back and ask ourselves what is the most valuable problem to solve, it's still the same problem that we have made quite a lot of progress on. But if we look at the whole thing, then not as much, as we're still running at 0.5%. And you mentioned some of the ways how do we get deeper? How do we bring these cheaper transfers to more people? You pointed out the borderless account. So the borderless account now gives you local account details in 6 or 7 countries. So if you're, say, a merchant in Sweden, you get your local account details, your bank account in US, in the UK, in New Zealand, in Australia, in Poland, and a few other places in Germany, so that you can invoice as a local business. So it's a bank account that works as a local bank everywhere in the world. So with that borderless account, we solved the inbound problem. Also for, say, freelancers who work for a foreign company and their paychecks would otherwise get converted into their local currency by the bank, and the bank would take the cut. Now they can get paid locally in the market where they're being paid. So this solves a different use case, but it's still the same problem of moving money across borders and banks trying to take a cut from it. And now adding to borderless as a way to receive funds onto your multi-currency account, we also attach a debit card to this account. We issue debit cards in Europe. We rolled out in the US 3 months ago. We rolled out in Australia and New Zealand 2 months ago, and last month we launched in Singapore. So these debit cards work in a clever way where they use the money that's already on your balance. So if I use this card in Singapore, it uses my Singapore dollar balance. If I'm in the US, it uses my US dollar balance. And it's again getting around this problem of, if you use your bank's card abroad, they're gonna try a few things on you. First of all, they of course use a poor exchange rate to rip you off on that one a little bit. But oftentimes they also, depending on the country, they would add an international transaction fee, which would be another charge on top of it. There are so many ways how this 200 billion comes together, and if we look at TransferWise, then it is expanding the ways how we help more people and businesses on their cross-border flows.
So you mentioned Singapore before. We're sitting in your beautiful Singapore office right now, and I think either just this week or maybe last week you put out a press release around the integration into, I think it was 6 of the more largely used wallets throughout Asia, which is a fascinating phenomenon that I think anyone who's Asia-based or has spent time over here is very well familiar with. Concept that in terms of storing money, spending money, sending, receiving, it's often done via non-bank wallets. Can you talk a bit about the importance of wallets in Singapore and Southeast Asia, and what kind of motivated your decision to connect into them?
This is a very good question. It's good to reflect that there's actually 3 generations of wallets. I would say the first generation was PayPal, and that's now 20 years ago. That was the world's first wallet. It was a place where people hold money, but it doesn't have an underlying bank account necessarily. The second generation wallets were, for me, the M-Pesa and all the flip-phone of feature phone based wallets, very widely available in Africa and also some parts of Asia, but not as ubiquitous. So they did really well in Africa. If you walk around kind of the Central African, Western East African countries, most people there, they have no reason to have a bank account because money moves easily between their telecom carrier-based wallets. And this is working really well. Now in Asia, we're seeing the growth of the third generation, which, as you said, are all the wallets that maybe China is the biggest example with Alipay and WeChat Pay, where using a bank account is just not very convenient. So those apps that we would always use, whether that's a taxi app like Grab or whether it's our kind of merchant app or a chat app, they would soon have wallets attached to them, and that's how we handle our money. So that's definitely a phenomenon in Asia, and equally we were seeing that we are really good at moving money from bank account to bank account, because in the Western world, that's mostly where money lives. Money lives in bank accounts. In Asia, that's not the case anymore. Money lives on bank accounts, yes, 98% of the times, but 2% of the times it lives on those wallets. And in some countries, this difference is much more pronounced. For example, in Indonesia, yes, some people have bank accounts and we deliver money to those bank accounts, but then you have like millions and millions and millions of people who happily use their wallets, and they have no business to go to a bank. And with that move of getting those 6 wallets live as destinations, We enabled 150 million people potentially receiving money in Asia internationally through TransferWise. So people who have wallets but don't have bank accounts. That's a pretty incredible number if we just thought about it for a second.
And I guess there's scope to bring on additional wallets over time.
Absolutely. And I think it's certainly a wave of how we see things developing. Maybe it's going to be Asia specific in the future. Maybe it's going to be a broader movement. But certainly delivering money to everywhere where it's held in electronic form. We still don't deal with cash. It's just too expensive and too hard to track.
I'd love to switch gears slightly and hear a bit more about the 8 years between founding in 2011 and where you are now. You guys have, I think, very clearly been one of the big UK fintech success stories, global fintech success stories. What one or two things in your mind were maybe most relevant in helping you scale globally so quickly?
I do think that we have a very, very clear problem to solve. It's almost the threshold of how expensive and how poor the international services that people and businesses get from their bank is kind of fueling our growth, or has been fueling our growth in the past. But the way we have thought about it is we've certainly benefited from focus and being really clear about why people join TransferWise and why do they recommend TransferWise. In fact, in the early days, we had this invite program where you could post a message to a friend on our website and we would email it to them, like, why should they use TransferWise? I remember reading through the messages that people wrote. That was super kind of enlightening of why do they recommend TransferWise to their friends. So this viral loop of recommendation loop has certainly technically been the thing that drives the growth. But the reason why people recommend it comes back to 3 or 4 things really, and we have codified these quite deeply into our organization. It starts with the cost. Most people switch just because it's cheaper to use TransferWise than to use their bank, and because it's also intransparent how banks charge it often comes with this aha effect, like when your friend tells you that you're nuts if you're still using your bank for wire transfers, and then you actually work out the detail of how much they've charged you in the last year and the kind of exchange rate markups. Then you go, okay, that was silly, I should never do that again. and I should tell my friends as well, because they probably kind of fell in the same trap. So that has usually started as a first step. Then people who then do start using TransferWise, one of the impressions they pick up is that they realize how fast it is. And we're in Singapore. It's a great example. So if you move money from your Singaporean bank account, say DBS, to a UK bank account, it's very likely to be under 20 seconds for your money to leave Singapore and arrive in a UK bank account. The same to Hong Kong, same to Australia. The US, it's slightly slower, but hopefully it's going to get...
This is using TransferWise, of course.
That's using TransferWise, yes. Yeah. In fact, 24% of all of our transfers all around the world, and we move about $5.5 billion US dollar equivalent every month. So 24% of that arrives in less than 20 seconds. So speed is certainly the other kind of thing that drives our growth. And the third and the fourth are slightly harder to track. One is certainly convenience, and that's where I said the banks previously have made it somewhat easy for us, just because in order to make it wasn't a long time ago when if you're a Wells Fargo customer and you need to make an international wire, you had to show up in their branch. I think now you can do it online as well. And then coverage, integrating into all these local payment networks. We're the first non-bank to integrate directly into Bank of England. That went live earlier last year. We're integrated directly into the Euro system. So we're cutting out the middlemen just to deliver the cost and speed savings.
And from an execution standpoint, that's no easy feat. It's one thing to have a great product that people want to use, but how do you actually bring it to dozens and dozens of markets very quickly in a regulated space, with great technology that works well at scale, that works well in different languages, presumably, and all sorts of various iterations?
There's a lot of hard work that has gone into this. We're now 1,800 people. We're still hiring. We have 300 job posts up there, so go and check it out. We're hiring in Singapore, Budapest, London, New York, Australia, Tokyo. So pretty much every corner of the world. Just find the closest place to you. And it isn't easy. So if you're looking for an easy job, don't even open the website. What we're here to do isn't easy.
To wrap up, maybe we can pull some of these pieces together. So we touched on the relevance of wallets. We touched on the way incumbent banks think about FX. We touched on TransferWise's B2C and B2B interests. As we kind of project forward and think about the evolution of the space, the digital banks that are increasingly building scale, whether it's throughout Europe, in the US, whether it's newly licensed virtual banks in Hong Kong, and I think soon to be Singapore. TransferWise is, as we mentioned, running its own digital account, at the same time offering B2B integrations. Where do you see the competitive dynamic kind of taking the space, and what does TransferWise need to do to stay most relevant going forward?
I think one interesting observation that I've made on the banking space is that when we compare banking and tech, we see that there's a lot more reach for a tech company. So you have like one Uber and then a few smaller players. You have one WhatsApp and then you have WeChat in China. But you don't have WhatsApp for every country. So we come from the place where you have like 3 or 4 banks for every country. We're 26,000 banks overall. And it's interesting as the banks turn more into tech companies, as they should. How's the competition between banks going to play out? Like, does the world really need 26,000 banks? And if they do, then what are all these banks going to do? It's, I think, quite likely that the banks themselves will need to specialize and find a niche, and that niche is unlikely to be geographic, as in it's unlikely to be that it's just this part of New York needs this new this particular bank. That's probably not going to be the case in the future, where everything is much more digital. So that thing, I'm very curious to see how it's gonna play out. But it doesn't matter how many banks there are or which these banks are, people and the people using those banks still need to move money across borders, across currencies. We're unlikely to move into a single currency like Libra or something else. We tried to do Eurozone. That was already, it was incredible that we managed to do that, but it was very hard. So going even bigger than Eurozone is hard to imagine anytime soon. So we'll still have national currencies in the future. We'll still need to move between them. And we're working here to provide the infrastructure both for people, for businesses, but also for banks to do that.
Excellent. Well, great to connect with you, Christo, and congratulations on all the wonderful work over the past few years. Look forward to watching you guys succeed well into the future.
Thanks, Will.
Christo Carmen, thank you very much for joining us today. Thanks for tuning in to Rebank. If you like today's show, reach out. Follow us on Twitter at Rebank Podcast and join the conversation. For more on banking, fintech, and the future, check out our regular content at www.bankingthefuture.com.